Hi everybody, welcome to class. Today we're going to talk about social problems and specifically what is a social problem. And since it's the beginning of the semester, we're also going to be talking about how the class format is set up, how the PowerPoints are set up, and what I cover in a lecture. So this particular video is one section of chapter 1. We're going to be talking about specifically what is a social problem, but the chapter as a whole covers what's a social problem, the different perspectives on social problems, which is essentially all the different theories on social problems, continuity and change on social problems. That's actually a social constructionist perspective, and so we'll be talking about it from that perspective, and I'll be using that language. And then doing research on social problems, which is, your research components, the steps in the research process, and a little bit of information regarding that. I always have something called think, pair, share questions. Your teachers might call this different things like your logic connection questions or just your reading questions, those types of things. So for this particular video and for this start of the chapter, we're going to be talking about, and you want to learn, what is a social problem? What's the difference between objective components and subjective components of social problems? And what's the difference between individual blame and system blame? So the definition of social problems is from the textbook is that a social problem is any condition or behavior that has a negative consequence. And they want to say a negative consequence for a large number of people, so they might mean thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of people, and that it's generally recognized by humanity as a social problem, and that it's a problem that has negative consequences that should actually be addressed. So it has three components. It is a condition that has negative consequences for a large number of people, that it's generally recognized as such, and that those problems should be addressed. It could be either objective, subjective, or both, and we'll talk about what that is. So in order to define something as a social problem, largely there needs to be both objective and subjective components that it is a social problem. So an objective component is what we would think of as a scientific or empirical fact. There's data, there's evidence, it's tangible. Empirical means something's tangible. You can touch it, see it, feel it, taste it, those types of things. And that those consequences, those negative consequences, impact society on a macro level, meaning large numbers of people, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people. A subjective component means that perception, there's a perception by society, scientists, policymakers, that those negative consequences need to be addressed in some way, shape, or form. And it also needs to have both the objective and subjective idea that the consequences are negative. If we were to consider those consequences to not be extensive and serious in matter, or negative in matter, then we would not consider it to be a social problem. So think of objective as data of negative consequences, macro level impact, and the subjective component as people having the perception that it's negative. So you have policymakers, citizens, scientists, people in general agreeing that it's negative. So how do we know that in general something has negative consequences? When we think about a social problem, we may or may not agree that a particular phenomenon in society is an actual social problem. You can look at almost anything that we would consider a social problem today and look back in time, and people would not have considered it to be a social problem. Let's take child abuse, for example. The SPCA was actually enacted before the SPCC, so the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, was founded and enacted years before the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. And the reason was that while abuse of children occurred, it was probably fairly widespread and impacted thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. Children, in large part, don't have a voice in society. They are not going to influence policymakers. And people in general just perceived that parents would not harm their children in such a fashion that they would abuse them significantly or kill them. So we have things like the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals emerge, I believe it was about 30 years before the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children emerge, both founded by the same person, by the way. And things today, for example. So while we know that most of us struggle finding a living wage, a good job that pays well, we don't perceive the lack of accessibility towards jobs that pay a living wage as a social problem, because we don't see that as something that has negative consequences for the masses of people, although it in reality very much does. The same thing with the lack of access to affordable housing. When people talk about homelessness, they often talk about it as a problem because they don't want to see people who are homeless. I hear this often in my community. So I don't want to have to see somebody homeless when I'm driving down the freeway or walking on my morning walk, because it might make me uncomfortable, quote unquote, right? So you hear people talk like this. The concern is that they don't want to have to see it. They don't want it in their backyard. The concern isn't the humanity side of it, where they don't want other people to have to suffer. They're largely okay with homelessness or people suffering, because as long as they don't have to actually see it or see the consequences with their own eyes, or it doesn't have to be within their community, their neighborhood, and they don't have to deal with it on a face-to-face basis, right? So they don't perceive homelessness to be such a real social problem, in that it's a lack of affordable housing or human rights for people. It's more of a social problem for many people, especially wealthy people, because they don't want to actually have to see any of it, so have any real personal interaction with somebody who is experiencing homelessness. So I kind of set up like a little and if situation, right? So let's talk about when is a social problem an actual social problem. If it has consequences for millions of people, think of an example, right? So if we're talking about an example like, let's use child labor here. Does it have consequences for millions of people? Is there empirical evidence that the consequences are negative, extensive, and serious? Are the negative consequences considered by people to be extensive and serious, meaning scientists, citizens, and policymakers? And is there a perception that that condition needs to be addressed? So you should be thinking in your head, okay, yes, no, right? So today, we are largely unaware of child labor. We don't realize that it still occurs in society. We don't think about child labor when we buy diamonds or we buy fast fashion clothing, because we, in large part, don't have to actually see children going through that type of extensive labor. So while it might have actual consequences for hundreds of thousands of children around the world, that doesn't mean that today citizens and policymakers would consider it to be extensive and serious, and they may not perceive it to be a condition that needs to be addressed. Let's try another one. How about How about intrafamilial sexual abuse by fathers towards daughters? So let's go back in history a little bit. So we know that historically, intrafamilial sexual abuse was often not perceived as something that existed. The symptoms that occurred in young women were perceived as social problems in that those women might have been disobeying their fathers, they may have been running away from home, or they may have been, as they hit puberty, becoming sexually active with other people. And so those were considered to be social problems, and fathers could put their daughters into insane asylums because their daughters were considered to be problematic. So that was considered to be the social problem as opposed to the actual sexual violence that was occurring between fathers and daughters. And even very prominent scientists of the time stated and believed that while they had client after client, female client, stating that they were being sexually abused by their fathers, they thought that this was not the case. This is exactly what Freud said. So Freud said essentially, I have come to believe that there's a mass hysteria occurring because almost all of my female clients in the that have been put into insane asylums by their fathers, they are claiming that they have been sexually abused by their fathers. And that could not actually be the case, and so therefore it must be some form of mass hysteria. So instead of being considered a social problem, the sexual abuse, the social problem was considered to be the mass hysteria of the daughters. Let's try another one. Why don't you think about it? I'll give you the example and then I'll kind of read through the evidence. And as I'm reading through it, why don't you think to see if you would consider it to be a social problem or not? So let's talk about child labor. Is it perceived to have negative consequences? Did we already use that one? Let's talk about climate change. Is it perceived to have negative consequences for millions of people? Climate change. Are the negative consequences considered extensive, serious by scientists, but not citizens? Is that a problem? Does that change whether it is actually considered to be a social problem? Is there empirical evidence of climate change? And is there a perception that the condition or behavior needs to be addressed? Let's try this one more time. So you should have a thought in your head whether you think climate change based on that. Those particular questions are a social problem. And I'll give you one more example. Attacks and bites by pit bulls and Rottweilers. Does this have negative consequences for thousands, hundred thousands of people, or millions of people? Are the negative consequences considered to be extensive and serious? Are they considered to be extensive and serious by citizens, by scientists, by policymakers? Is there empirical evidence? Is there a perception that the condition or behavior needs to be addressed? So, I'll help you kind of go through this one, right? So is the consequences on a macro level? I would say no, it's probably not on a macro level. Is there empirical evidence? No, there's actually not very much empirical evidence that there are large numbers of dog attacks by specific breeds. There's probably evidence against that, that certain breeds are no more likely to attack than any other type of breed. Is there negative consequences considered to be serious by citizens? Yes. Policymakers? Yes, they make laws against this. We even have, even insurance agencies have different insurance policies based on the breed of your dog, and by scientists? No. Is there a perception that the condition or behavior needs to be addressed? Absolutely. And we know this because we've seen laws and policies in cities, states, and municipalities. See how complicated it can be? Let's talk about another one. So, the one that the textbook brings up is rape or sexual assault, right? So is this an actual social problem? Well, prior to the 1970s, as Americans, we didn't consider rape or sexual assault to be a social problem. It was never discussed among policymakers. Men were rarely, if ever, convicted and put in jail for rape or assault. And we didn't talk about it within academia, so scientists were not discussing it as well. There was not research into it, that type of thing. Even when we go back into history, we can see that sexual assault of even very young children was treated very differently based on whether the assault was focused towards boys versus girls. So in the Roman era, assault or rape of a child was considered to be a humiliation for the family. So I believe it was in 1548, you have legal protection in Rome from what they call forced sodomy, so sexual assault of boys. But it wasn't until 1576, almost 30 years later, that you have legal protection of forcible rape for girls, and that was still even has a age quota on it, so girls under the age of 10. So there was still not legal protection of rape or assault for girls age 11 and older. So one of the reasons why sociologists talk about social problems as a social construction is because social problems tend to fit the definition of what we would consider to be a social construction. One of the primary reasons is because social problems change over time. So if you look at this table, look at the bottom of the table, in 1935, 8 through 10, inadequate pensions for the elderly, high concentration of wealth, and drinking alcohol were social problems. But by 2012, education, moral and ethical decline, and the gap between the rich and the poor were considered the social problems that were in the 8 through 10 category. So what we consider to be an actual social problem changes from culture to culture, it changes over time, and it has to be socially agreed on by people in masses. This kind of gives you another idea of how you can create create like your logic table for how you would consider something to be a social problem or not. So this tells you, is it subjectively considered a social problem or objectively? So homicide, yes, subjectively we consider that a social problem, and objectively. The use of automobiles, subjectively most people don't consider it a social problem, but objectively it does harm thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people a year. So you might have been thinking until now that, if something's going to cause harm, death to hundreds of thousands of people, or even 1 million people, that everybody would consider that to be a social problem. And that's simply not the case. Okay, let's talk a little bit about individual blame and system blame. So this is a concept widely used in social problems in general. And oftentimes when people, prior to getting into sociology, prior to having an education, most people think on a micro level. So their frame of thinking and understanding the world is individual to individual. And so when they think about a social problem, they only can consider the consequences or the blame or the focus to be on an individual. Drug use is a good example of this. So when people think about drug use as a social problem, they think about individual choice and individual health consequences. So drug use is a problem for individuals, created by individuals, and individuals are responsible for their own actions. People don't consider systemic issues and macro level issues, and this is largely due to a lack of education and practice. We don't teach it. We don't teach people how to understand social structural issues or institutional issues, or even macro level issues, and how those create consequences for people. So if we are thinking about drug use and we're looking at it from a system blame problem, so what are the structural problems that create drug use within communities? We know that there's a lot of evidence that suggests a lack of access to the economy. In other words, when communities lack access to jobs, the number of individuals within that community who start using drugs and start having drug problems increases dramatically. So when we talk about system blame, and we're talking about social structures or institutions, what or how do those social structures create a situation that then causes negative consequences for communities? So we're talking macro level to macro level, right? So what government policies and laws create situations that cause or set up negative consequences for mass amounts of people? What type of educational, institutional problems do we have? What type of, when we talk about institution in religion, we're talking about religious organizations. And we talk about economics, we're talking about usually access to the economy or access to wealth. And then family as an institution is not your family specifically, it's the structure of families. So in our culture, we're very heteronormative. We assume that you will have a nuclear heteronormative family. And so that is what we would call an institution or a social structure, right? That's how our society is set up. So in that government, education, the economy, religion, and family, they have their own norms, their own values, their own social structures. Those structures and policies or the lack of access into those types of social structures or institution can sometimes result in consequences, both apparent and latent consequences. So the drug use and lack of access to the economy is a good one. If you talk about the economy in terms of capitalism and lack of access to living wage jobs, that then creates a situation where you see increased rates of homelessness, right? People don't have access to affordable housing. They don't have access to living wage jobs. And then so communities and large numbers of people are more likely to end up without housing or without being able to sustain housing on a regular basis. I hope you enjoyed your first lecture, and I hope you have a great day. Welcome to Social Problems.